At 2:13 a.m., the cheap wall clock in Layla's one-room flat jerked, stuttered, and froze like it had remembered something it didn't want to say. And in that breathless stall, her 4-year-old, Tari, silent for nearly 2 years and newly walking since the candlelit service, sat upright with a smoothness that did not belong to a sleepy child, and spoke in a low, borrowed tone that turned her blood thin. "The door is a mouth. Don't let it learn your name." He didn't look at her. His eyes were open but unfocused, as if fixed on a thin seam in the air where the night pressed its face against the world, and the fluorescent bulb above them flickered, sighed, and died, leaving the room in a clotted darkness that smelled faintly of wet iron and old riverbanks. Layla's fingers found the spine-worn Bible beneath her pillow and clenched until the paper edges bit, because fear needed something to bite harder than her. Outside, Nsango's wind crawled along the corridor and cupped the window pane with a careful hand, testing its strength. And inside, the heat suddenly felt patient, like a waiting animal flattening itself in tall grass. Tari lifted his right hand without looking, slid a nub of charcoal from beneath his pillow, how had he hidden that again, and began to draw on the bedsheet with tiny, unhesitating strokes. A spiral of 7 rings, each scored with a neat notch at the top, like a tally, precise and impossible for a boy who used to fall while standing still. And when he reached the 7th ring, he breathed out with relief that didn't sound like his relief at all. Layla snatched the charcoal and yanked the sheet away, but the spiral had already ghosted through fabric, bleeding into the thin mattress like a bruise she would never explain. She pulled the boy into her arms and felt cold radiating from his belly outward, a chill that ignored skin and bone and seemed to belong to a place where sun did not bargain. 3 soft taps came from the window, not the door. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. Gentle as fingertips learning a new instrument, and the curtain breathed inward although the night was windless, and the sound that followed was not a voice, but a mouth thinking about a word, slippery and near. She pressed her forehead to Tari's, forced to draw to unlock, and whispered the only sentence that still felt like stone in a flood. "You are mine." The tap stopped. The clock coughed back into motion, each click jagged, each click a nail pounded through her certainty. Somewhere on the floor a roach skittered and died soundlessly as if it had stepped across a border it could not see. Tari swallowed, then spoke in that same least register, a tone that did not carry his small heat. "She's counting. She needs 6 more. She says you already paid with thanks." Layla's stomach turned because gratitude had been the softest door of all. The white-wrapped woman in the hidden bungalow, Mother Mirabelle, whose whisper made the keyboard tremble in the candle's lean, who laid a hand on Tari's head and called him remembered, who requested something with your scent for Thanksgiving, who drew a chalked circle and ringed it with shallow bowls of water that breathed when no one did. Layla had dropped her headscarf there 3 nights ago, and peace had followed her home like a dog she didn't own. Now the room smelled like the church again, salted wax and rain that hadn't fallen yet, and in that smell she heard the thin music of the 4-note tune Tari had begun to hum since the healing, the one that made the kitchen tap drip right on the 4th note, the one she could not forget because it had no beginning and refused to end. Her phone lit and died in the same blink. The bulb throbbed back to a dim life. A wet ring had formed around the feet of the iron bed as if the floor were remembering a tide, and on the wall, without a hand to guide it, a narrow track of moisture shaped itself into a curve that wanted to be a circle, a slow, patient loop that would close if she blinked too long. She didn't blink. She dragged the straw mat to the far corner, set Tari on it, wrapped his head in the thin white scarf she kept for funerals, anything to change the air touching his ears. And because terror makes commands sound like prayers, she said, "Don't listen, don't answer, don't look." And for a second the room seemed to recoil like a creature hissed at in the dark. The wind withdrew from the glass. The wet ring shivered and stilled. The spiral on the mattress stopped bleeding. But the clock kept its new rhythm, and every tick sounded like a step closer, and when she finally dared to breathe, Tari turned his face to hers with the slow, solemn certainty of a witness, and said, almost kindly, as if telling her where the road split, "The door is still hungry, Mama, and now it knows you have a name."
At noon, 2 days before the clock betrayed them, the market in Sango steamed like a pot left too long on a charcoal stove, and Leela, jaw tight, wrapper damp, tarry slack on her back, stood at a stall haggling over pop, when a voice from a life she thought had rusted away said her name softly, like testing a match. Leela. She turned and saw Chinara, the quiet girl from their SS2 class who used to write answers in the margins of hymn books. Only now her blouse was mustard clean, her hair pinned like a sentence that wouldn't run on, and her smile did not reach her eyes. Chinara skipped reunion talk and went straight to direction. "There is a service," she said, lowering her voice as though the tomatoes could gossip. "No signboard, no noise. Mother Mirabel. She listens for God. She doesn't shout at him." Leela's stomach clenched. Hospitals had bled her thin. Vigils had left her hoarse. Syrups had stained her pillow with metal. So the promise of a whisper felt like a trick only the exhausted would respect, and she hated that she respected it. Still, after sunset, she followed Chinara through the alleys behind the cassava mounds where the smell of wet earth wore a candle's perfume, into a low bungalow whose windows breathed light as if they had lungs. Inside, the sound wasn't music. It was a thread, one finger on a keyboard summoning a four-note pattern that circled without landing, and with each loop the air compressed gently around rib cages until everyone inhaled together like a congregation learning how to be one chest. Mother Mirabel stood barefoot, white wrapper clean as an argument, a narrow staff resting against her palm. She kept her eyes closed and spoke as if borrowing breath from stone. "There is a child who was born whole, and then divided by hands that do not know they are knives," she murmured. "Bring him." Tari, who tripped over flat ground, who had not fed her a word in 23 months, slid down from Leela's back and walked straight, step by step to the front. The room gasped the way a crowd does when a rope breaks over a river. Leela could not move. Her legs had become witnesses. Mirabel laid a palm on Tari's head and said, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a clarity that felt like cold water poured on fever, "He is remembered." The candles leaned toward the voice. The bowls of water on the floor quivered, though no one had touched the mats. Leela clutched the pew until splinters introduced themselves to her skin and cried without tears, the body wringing out a grief so tired it had only the strength to shiver. After the amens were swallowed by the walls, Chinara pressed an envelope into Leela's hand. It was warm, as if it had just been breathed on. "Gratitude on Friday," she whispered. "Bring something with your scent." Leela asked why. Chinara's smile remembered nothing. "Thanksgiving. The river likes thanks more than begging." Leela did not like the word river belonging to a room, but she went because Tari laughed that night for the first time in a year and a half, a small, startled bark of joy that made the metal spoon in her hand ring against the enamel plate. And in the morning he hummed the four-note pattern while watching light move across the cracked wall, and on the fourth note the kitchen tap began to drip as if a hidden throat had cleared itself. Friday, the compound's back room was dim and low. White chalk drew a circle on the floor, and shallow bowls of water ringed it like watchful eyes. Women came with baby blankets, a wedding ring on a string, a shoe wrapped in cloth. No one spoke above the keyboard's thread. When it was Leela's turn, she stepped into the chalk and let her headscarf fall from her fingers. "Thank you for giving me back my son," she breathed. Mirabel's lids lifted a fraction, and in that thin slit of gaze Leela saw not kindness, but certainty, as if the woman recognized a debt and a signature. "The river accepts." A draft slid across Leela's ankles. The candle shook once. The bowls of water plucked tiny sounds like fingernails on glass. And something passed through Leela's body that was neither heat nor cold, but a rearrangement, as though her bones had been alphabetized without permission. She walked home carrying silence like a bowl full of water. That night, Tari said, "Mama," and Leela died and came back to life between one heartbeat and the next, because resurrection always costs a death somewhere. The next morning he drew a woman whose eyes did not blink and a crown woven of snakes. And when Leela asked, voice playful to hide the way her skin had pulled tight, "Is that me?" Tari shook his head and pointed at the tap, which began to drip in time with his humming's fourth note. That evening the flat smelled faintly of rain, though the streets were dry, and when Leela lay down,
She realized the piece on her pillow didn't weigh right. Too smooth, too even, like a borrowed name that fit the mouth but not the history. At 1:47 a.m. she woke to a low tremor in the floorboards, a warning purr from a thing that preferred patience, and she understood what gratitude had bought. Not an ending, but a path paved with permission.
Kene arrived the next afternoon with sweat-dark crescents under his arms and a backpack that clattered like it held evidence instead of textbooks. And before Layla could offer him water, he had the bag unzipped and his phone unlocked, scrolling through a folder titled Asango Cases, with the grim excitement of someone who had finally found a pattern terrible enough to be true. There were screenshots of grainy Facebook Lives from anonymous revivals, WhatsApp voice notes forwarded 50 times until the S's rasped like snakes, and shaky vertical clips of women in white wrappers whispering while children straightened like strings pulled taut. First a boy in Adariba who said mama after 9 years of silence and then vanished on a church retreat. Then a girl in Idoma whose twisted legs unspooled during a midnight service and was last seen near a covert where candles floated like orphaned eyes. Then another clip with a caption that made Leela's stomach tip, Prophetess M's River Thanksgiving, and the thumbnail showed a chalk circle and bowls of water exactly like the one she had stepped into. Kene's thumb stabbed the screen as if he could pin the truth to the glass. They changed names, he said breath fast. Mirabel becomes Maraya, becomes Mariama, becomes Mami Mira, but the layout is the same. No signboard, white cloth, keyboard thread, water close by, and every compound less than a kilometer from a natural source, lagoon, culvert, drain, actual river. Miracles, then disappearances within 90 days. Not a church, a supply chain. Layla wanted to tell him to stop because the syllables were making heat leak from her bones, but Tari was sitting cross-legged on the mat, humming the 4-note loop and pushing bottle caps into a precise, spiraled helix that matched the shape he had drawn on the bedsheet. He didn't look up when Kene crouched and asked gently, "Buddy, what are you building?" Tari's finger traced the curve without touching it. "She counts like this," he said to the air. 7 rings, 1 mouth each. Layla's throat burned. She told Kene about the gratitude ritual, the headscarf, the sentence Mirabel had said, the river accepts, and the way a draft had slid around her ankles as if something exhaled from the floor. Kene listened without smirking, which scared her more than his arguments. "Gratitude as consent," he muttered finally. "You didn't beg for a deal, you thanked your way into one. That's smarter than oil and shouting." He pulled the dog-eared campus atlas from his bag and sketched a crude map of Asango with a biro, circling waterways and scarring short lines where he remembered revival videos having been geotagged. She's not only hunting the sick, she's hunting the loud pain. It makes a signal. Rivers prefer what echoes. He was still talking when the light in the room lost its temperature, flattening like a frightened animal. Layla knew the feeling now, air that remembered water, and her fingers tightened around the Bible before her brain could choose. At 2:13 a.m., because the betrayal had a schedule, the window gave 3 delicate taps, not a knock for entry, but a rehearsal of a name. And the curtain bellied once though the night was holding its breath, and Layla's cheap techno lit with a ghost-white glow, stuttered to 2:14 and died as if the numbers had scared it. Kenny's torch caught for a heartbeat, a wedge of light slicing the floor, and in that slice they saw water leaking from no crack, pooling into a neat ring whose inner edge found Tari's bare feet, and cupped them without wetting them, as if learning his outline by touchless study. Tari's humming stopped on the 4th note, and without moving his mouth, his voice slid out. Older, distant, thread dry. "She says I am remembered. She says Mama will be too." Layla didn't mind that her knees failed. She crawled the last distance, snatched the child from the ring, and flung the rolled mat across the water as if it were a bridge for unseen things and not for her boy. The torch died. In the dark, a sound pressed against the glass. A wet thought, lips forming a word just before it becomes one. And the cheap wall clock coughed and reset itself with a single brutal tick that echoed under the bed. "Names," Kene whispered, so soft the word hardly survived. "She needs the mother's true name to fix the chain." The ring of water did not spread. It waited, patient as rot. On the plaster beside the window, a slow track of dampness began to scrawl a thin arc that would have closed if she had blinked again. She didn't blink. She ripped the thin funeral scarf from the nail, wrapped it around Tari's head as Mama Ifeoma would later teach her to do, and felt the humming around them shiver like a disappointed choir. The dap arc stalled. The ring of water quivered and thinned. The taps stopped, but the clock kept going, not with comfort, but with hunger. And Kene, voice steady in the way of men who are frightened on behalf of people they love, said, "There's a woman in Orie. She doesn't like titles. They say she retired from deliverance because she started telling the truth about what churches pretend not to know. If anyone can cut a thread you thanked yourself into, it's her." Layla, who had never walked away from a fight that had already crossed her threshold, nodded once. "Then we go at dawn," she said, and the room, as if greedy for announcements, leaned in to listen.
Mama Ifeoma's compound sat at the lip of Orie like a stern sentence at the end of a page. Low walls, swept sand, bitterleaf hedges breeding a clean medicinal anger. And when Layla, Tari, and Kene stepped inside, the heat seemed to pause to listen to their footsteps. The old woman was waiting in the shade with her head wrapped in faded indigo, and her eyes narrowed the way people squint at storm lines on the horizon. And she did not waste a greeting on which she already knew. "Bring the child," she said, voice flat as a blade laid on a table. In the parlor, no couches, no saints, only a raffia mat, a clay pot dark with use, a low bowl dusted with palm ash. She kneeled to Tari's level, cupped his cheeks, and hummed a single note that felt less like sound and more like a weight settling evenly across the room. Tari's pupils tightened, then drifted, and in that strange dilation, Ifeoma sighed like a woman recognizing a badly tied knot. "He was offered," she said, "not by malice, by grief that mistook gratitude for payment. Rivers love thanks when it replaces consent." Layla's mouth formed "no," but the word broke its ankle before it reached air. Kene stepped in with strategy instead of comfort. "Can we cut it?" Mama Ifeoma did not look up. "You don't snip a covenant you thanked into place. You unname it." She set the boy back, stood with the careful economy of someone who has taught her bones not to complain, and drew a thin circle of ash around the mat. "There is a room behind the room where you went," she said, and Layla felt her spine remember the curtain that had swallowed the watcher. "You will be taken there again, invited, not dragged. There will be a thing that calls itself a mirror. It does not reflect, it collects. It will offer you the easiest route between terror and relief. Do not look. Not if it shows your child whole, not if it shows him dying without pain. Not if it offers your mother's voice by the bucketful. Looking is agreeing." Her palm opened. In it lay 3 austere tools, a small sachet of camphor salt stitched shut with red thread, a loop of coral beads gone dull with years of sweat, and a narrow strip of white cloth embroidered with brown glyphs that didn't sit comfortably in any alphabet Kene recognized. "Salt to sting the mouth," she said, pressing the sachet into Layla's hand. "Beads to anchor your breath where your breath belongs." She tied them to Layla's wrist with a firmness that refused argument. To Tari, she wrapped the cloth around his head like a band that knew its business. "For the hours that aren't ours," she added quietly, "there's one in your flat, 213, where the house forgets to belong to you. This will remind it." Tari shivered, then steadied, and the air in the room released a long-held clench. "How many mouths?" Kene asked, because fear always turns into arithmetic with him. Ifeoma walked to the clay pot, dipped her fingers and flicked 3 cold drops to the floor. 7, she said. "You've already cracked one. The ledger will have your boy's name crossed, but a ledger is a hungry pet. It will seek the next, and when a mother meddles, it adds hers. Names are doors. If she learns yours properly, she will open you from the inside." She turned to Layla. "Find your naming, anything, a voice, a paper, a witness, the first thing that called you into shape. Put it in the mouth of your house so the walls memorize it." Her gaze cut sideways, listening to something none of them heard. She bent,
pinched ash and drew 4 small sigils on the threshold as if correcting the doorway's posture. Outside, the afternoon heat trembled. Inside, a draft curled around their ankles with the intimacy of a cat that had never liked them but suddenly needed to sit on their lap. "She's near," Ipheoma murmured. "Not the thief in white, the one who wears the churches like wet clothes, the water that remembers wrong." She clapped once, low. The draft flinched. The bowl of ash sighed. "You will go back to that altar," she said, facing Layla fully now. "You will not bargain. You will not answer questions that begin with, 'Who are you?' to refuse. You will not repeat your name even to yourself. Pour the salt in a ring around the watcher. If it moans, it's working. It will show you futures like bracelets in a tray. Do not try them on." Layla nodded because there was nothing else to do. Fear had moved from her throat to her hands, where it could be held. "And if I fail?" she asked, and hated the crack in her own voice. "Then," Mama Ipheoma said, not unkindly, "you run with the child and let your shame live. Shame keeps you fast." She shifted to Tari, and in a tone that had no candy in it said, "If she sings, you do not finish the song. You hum nothing, you chew your tongue if you must." Tari blinked once like a soldier learning a simple order. Ipheoma walked them to the gate. "Tonight we'll pretend to be quiet," she said. "Quiet is her best trick. Do not mistake it." At the threshold, she pressed a rusty bell into Kene's palm. Not for sound, for weight. Some nights reality needs reminding it is heavier than a mouth. As they stepped into the road, the sky over Orie went the color of a bruise learning to heal, and Layla, with salt in her fist and a name to recover, understood the shape of the work, not to win, but to refuse exactly when refusal hurt most.
The compound behind the vandalized signboard, Living Water Tabernacle, smeared into LVGWTR, looked abandoned in the way a snake looks dead when it's just watching you breathe. Weeds split the concrete. The gate hung from one hinge without squealing, and the courtyard air had that flat, wet canvas silence that remembers choirs but refuses to echo them back. Layla's coral beads clicked once against her wrist as she climbed the wall with Kene's boost and lowered Tari over, the boy's head wrapped in Mama Ipheoma's white band like a commandment. Inside, pews slumped under a lace of dust. Ceiling fans wore cobweb beards, but the altar was polished to a shine that felt indecent, 7 candles burning unnaturally steady, as if wind had been bribed to behave. Behind the altar, the curtain was not fabric so much as a shadow pretending to be, and when Layla pinched it aside, the air thickened into a damp throat. The room behind the room was small and circular, walls pressed close as if trying to hear, the floor chalked and smudged with rings where feet had learned to stand wrong. It hovered at the center, a round, floating thing that called itself a mirror only because mirrors have good reputations. Its surface moved like oil on cold water, and when Layla lifted a hand, her reflection smiled before she did, then raised its hand after, a smug delay that proved it wasn't reflecting, it was deciding. Tari tugged her wrapper, voiced a tight whisper that didn't belong in a child's mouth. She wants to finish counting. Kene's torch skated across the hover and came back with static in its throat, the light grainy like it had touched a bad memory. In her palm, the camphor salt sachet felt heavier than cloth and crystals, as if it remembered being a rock that said no to weather. She heard Mama Ipheoma's voice the way some people hear their own doubt. Pour the ring, don't bargain. And before fear could talk her out of obedience, she tore the sachet's seam with her teeth and walked a slow circle around the watcher, salt hissing on tile like rain on a hot blade. The thing shivered, the temperature dropped without breeze. The 7 candles bowed once toward the center as if listening to a better choir. The surface of the watcher bulged outward like a held breath, then cratered inward with a sound like a soft bone breaking. It didn't shatter like glass, it imploded like a decision, swallowing its own skin, a dark bead collapsing into itself until nothing hung there but a ring of cold air that made the hairs on Layla's forearm stand to attention. The curtain behind her exhaled,
The wall ahead of her sighed and showed its secret. Names scratched into plaster with something sharper than nails, 7 in a column like a prayer turned into a shopping list. 2 had been crossed cleanly with a single slash that tore into the brick beneath, Kizito, Tari, and 5 remained uncut, Benum, Sophia, Enola, Nkem, Dara. Kane leaned in as if he could argue the letters into a different order. A ledger, he breathed. Not triumph, not defeat, accounting. Tari's banded head tilted. He whispered, "She keeps them in the water till the song forgets them." A footfall answered that line, but not with sound, with certainty. Mother Mirabel was in the doorway, as if she had been there while they learned to be brave, bare feet clean, white wrapper without crease, carved staff in her palm like punctuation. "You came without invitation," she said, and the gentleness in her tone felt like the kind of mercy that only opens cages to lead you into a different one. Layla didn't give the voice her name to climb. She kept her mouth closed around it the way you keep your tongue off a cracked tooth. Mirabel's gaze moved to the ring of salt. "Childish," she said, but she did not step across it. She touched the staff to the floor, and somewhere below their feet, water answered with a small, pleased sound. "You could have had the easy grief," she murmured. "We would have taken the pain and left you with the story of a miracle." Layla's laugh showed its teeth. "You left me the bill." The staff ticked again. In the courtyard, something deep and round woke. The well, remembering it had a throat. Kane grabbed Tari and reversed to the doorway. Layla backed after them, never turning her shoulders to the watcher's absence, because absence can pounce. The curtain hissed as if stitched with small snakes. In the sanctuary, the 7 altar candles did not waver, but their flames leaned toward the aisle like they had caught a scent. They ran. At the threshold, the air thickened, the way water hugs you just before it agrees to drown you, and the well in the courtyard burped out a bubble of blacker dark. A voice rose from it, soft and hewn from riverbanks, not Mirabel's, older and pleased. "You break mouths, I will teach the wind to sing." The message slithered into Layla's ear and tried on her mother's cadence. She flinched and shoved the coral beads hard into her wrist until the pain proved her. The gate did not creak when they shoved it. Gates that watch don't need to announce themselves. Outside, the street air felt thinner, like nothing out there believed them yet. Kane didn't stop moving until 3 corners and a whispering alley separated them from the compound. Tari clung to Layla's hip, pulse rabbit fast. Only then did the world remember to make ordinary sounds. Motorbikes like quarrels, a baby scolding a bottle, vendors cursing the heat. And in that rush of human noise, Layla understood the exact shape of what they had done. They had not won. They had made the hunt look up. Behind her teeth, her name weighted like a closed fist. In her pocket, a smear of salt gritted her knuckles. On her phone, which now agreed to show a clock again, the numbers read 2:09, and Layla felt the hour coming like a train you can't see yet, but can feel in your feet.
The hour after they fled, the watcher pretended to be ordinary, but ordinary wore a mask. Traffic bickered. Hawkers sang the price of tomatoes like grudges. And yet every reflective surface Layla passed, bus windows, a puddle the sun was strangling, seemed to pause a millisecond too long on her face, as if testing its ownership. So she dragged Tari and Kenny back to Mama Ifeoma's compound, where the hedges breathed that medicinal anger, and the light felt rehearsed. The old woman listened to their report without blinking, then pressed the rusty bell into Kenny's palm again. Not for sound, for wheat. Hold the world down if it tries to slide. And told Layla, names are doors. She has your boy's door smeared with salt. Now she will try your hinge. Find your naming. As if summoned by the sentence, a parcel lay waiting at the threshold when they stepped back into the lane. No postage, no sender, wrapped in brown paper that smelled faintly of damp hymn books. Inside was a crisp photo of 7-year-old Layla in a faded sky blue uniform, braid stiff as exclamation marks, and on the back a line of tidy ink that made her stomach fold. I have always known your name. You forgot mine. The script looked like a teacher's patience, but the message carried river weight. Mama Ifeoma's mouth thinned. She will try to rewrite the beginning so she can tax the ending. Anchor, she ordered, and Layla went scouring through a dented trunk of her dead mother's things. Certificates curled by harmattan, a church fan with a split tongue, letters blotted by sorrow, and found, at the bottom, where the dust kept its secrets organized, a cracked plastic cassette box labeled in a careful hand, Layla's naming, 1996. Kenny sprinted to the junction and returned with a battered player whose mouth sometimes ate tape and sometimes obeyed. By dusk, the compound smelled like bitter leaf boiling on charcoal and camphor salt folded into sacks, and the children, Tari with the white band hugging his brow, a neighbor's baby Ifioma had taken in for the hour to tangle the air with another heartbeat, drowsed in the corner as the sky went bruised dark. At 3:33, the time Mama called a hinge the night respects, Layla stood naked and shivering in a ring of salt, skin slick with steeped bitter leaf and the sharp steam of truth, while Tari held the cassette player like a chalice and Kenny gripped the bell the way a drowning man holds the last solid thing. The tape clicked, chewed, and then her mother's voice poured into the room like a hand cupping a newborn skull. Her name is Layla. Peace we waited for, river we crossed. May her name guard her when I cannot. The hedges outside bowed as if a wind had finally remembered its manners. Again, Mama Ifioma said, voice soft as a threat, and Tari pressed play a second time. The mango tree in the yard shook without breeze, leaves clattering like an audience whose clapping refuses to be polite. On the third repetition, the temperature dropped by a thought, the bulb overhead breathed out, and a smear of wetness scrawled itself across the wall above the threshold in 4 slow words that did not drip. You were mine first. The sentence did not sound. It arrived inside Layla's head with the weight of a lullaby sung through teeth. And along with it came a face pressed into the skin of reality itself. A woman-shaped silence with no reflection, pouring over Layla like a censor editing a baptism. Let me be the mother who made you, that borrowed thought cooed. I can sing your childhood until it forgets the smell of dust. Layla's jaw shook so hard her molars chimed, but Mama Ifioma's palm knifed the air, and the old woman hissed, "Do not repeat anything in your skull." And the command drew blood from Layla's tongue where she had bitten it to keep it hers. The bell in Kenny's hand didn't ring. It sank, heavy, certain, gravity in a fist, and the floor remembered how to be floor. The wet words blistered, then ran like old mascara. Layla lifted her chin with a stubbornness she had learned from hunger, and spoke, not sweet, not brave, simply correct. I am not your naming. I refuse your mouth. Reality cracked, not with noise, but with that internal tilt you feel when a dream decides it owes you nothing, then settled, and the tape thunked to a stop with the blunt dignity of work finished. Tari exhaled like a diver breaking surface and sagged into Mama's thigh, while the white band around his head warmed as if it had caught a cold meant for someone else. Outside, a dog that had been whining at nothing swallowed its complaint. Inside, the air crawled back onto the bones it had abandoned. You bought time, Mama Ifioma said, wiping sweat from her jaw with the back of her wrist, eyes still listening to some place Layla couldn't see. Time is not mercy, it is rope. Use it. From the far corner, the baby Ifioma had borrowed woke and laughed at nothing, and that laughter wove itself through the room like a fence. But the quiet that followed had seams, in them something paced. The techno on the mat ticked to 2:13 and kept going, for once refusing to fold the house into a mouth. But Layla knew the thief in white would not nurse her wounds for long. A network didn't survive on miracles alone. It needed names and ledgers and new doors to pick. She collapsed onto the raffia and gathered Tari, whose pulse was a small drum insisting on mourning. In the threshold, the ash sigils Mama had drawn foamed like salt meeting ocean. From the yard came the softest of sounds, a single drop of water falling with the satisfaction of a note placed back where it belongs, and the hedges exhaled. "She will come again," Kenny said, voice steady because he had chosen to be a wall, not a window. "Let her," Mama murmured, tying Coral tighter around Layla's wrist until the beads bit. "Tonight the house remembers who it belongs to. Tomorrow we hunt the song that taught her to steal."
At dawn, a message without a number bruised Ken's phone. Just a set of coordinates and a name that had already appeared on the ledger behind the watcher, Enola. And by the time the sun leaned up out of the river, they were following a clay road to a lagoon village where even the dogs seemed to dream in 4 notes. Women skimmed water into bowls, men checked nets, and every mouth hummed the same unfinished tune, soft as breath, precise as counting, so that the whole place sounded like a choir practicing a word it didn't intend to understand. Leela felt the melody thread her ribs, looking for a place to knot. The coral bit her wrist and gave her body back. They found the girl knee-deep in the lagoon, not floating, not standing, just held, water cinched around her shins like a decision, braids tight, eyes too old. When she noticed them, she did not blink, only tilted her head the way owls audit strangers. "You came before the hour," she said in a layered voice that braided a child's timbre with something that had learned patience underwater. "One question only." Leela had a storm of questions ready. Where is the mouth? How many mirrors? How to salt a song? But the only one that escaped was the one her fear shaped. "What are you?" Enola's lips curved into a smile that did not entertain comfort. "Memory of water wearing a borrowed throat," she said, and then she folded like paper, body hot with a heat that did not belong to fevers. Kenneth caught her under the arms. The lagoon sighed as if disappointed to lose her weight. Back at Mama Ifeoma's, Tari hovered close to the burl as if a magnet was buried in both small chests. Without speaking, he handed her a sketch. Enola, older, holding a staff woven from riverlight and something darker that refused to be named. The girl, shivering, pressed the paper to her sternum and whispered, "I have seen this place from the other side." At 2:13, the house did not fold into a mouth. Instead, the mirror over the wash basin split its reflection into hairline lines, while the glass stayed whole, and in that glitch, a woman with a head wrap and no reflection mouthed through the silver, "6 more," then smeared into nothing like a thumb across steam. "Enough," Kenne said, dropping an object wrapped in plastic onto the raffia, a half-burned, leather-bound booklet rescued from a retired archivist who had been trying to forget it. The title in a missionary's cramped hand declared, "Kimbu, the First Song." Marginalia scuttled along the edges, panicked notes about tones that did not obey Western staff lines. Mama Ifeoma traced the ink with a finger that had slapped harder truths into people's heads. Not melody, seed. If we sing it wrong, silence eats the edges. If we sing it right, mouths find themselves starved. They laid 7 stones in a circle and sifted palm mash into the salt until the boundary muttered like a live wire. Leela set the cassette of her naming on the floor to hum a spine into the room. Tari and Enola were seated back to back in the center, heads banded, hands open as if receiving a weight. Mama Ifeoma didn't begin with pitch. She began with breath, the drag before a note that tells a throat what it's about to become. The house leaned inward, the candles, unasked for, tilted toward the floor. Tari's hum entered low as a cat under furniture, Enola's answered a register higher, and somewhere between them, the walls remembered a shape they had not kept for years. The air buckled like heat above tar and split. The room peeled away without moving. They were standing in ribs, not trees, not pillars, ribs curving into a sky that sweated moonlight. Underfoot, the ground pulsed like a throat. A woman wrapped in white stood ahead with serenity carved into her face like a dare, and from the middle of her chest, a third watcher pushed forward. Not glass, not metal, a mouth shaped like a mirror that reflected nothing and offered everything. It breathed futures and hung them at eye level like jewelry. Leela saw herself on a stage, sunlight on her teeth, money like applause. Tari smiling from a balcony far away. She blinked and saw herself laughing into a corner while a lullaby gnawed the wallpaper.
blinked again, and saw the brown river take her face and keep it. "Not visions," the woman said, voice building its nest inside their skulls. "Prices." Mama Ifeoma's throat caught on a curve of the seed song that would not be sung by human cartilage. For a blink, the mouth mirror widened as if inhaling a decision. Tari took the missing curve and sang it small and perfect, like a thread through a needle's eye. Enola closed it with a line that felt like a door meeting its frame. The woman's calm cracked, her chest mouth fractured inward with a sound like wet pottery sighing into shards. The ribs shuddered. The sky wrung itself out. They were back in the room, the circle of stones sweating. On the mat where the watcher had hung, a shallow pool spread and steadied, reflecting not faces, but a memory, Leela's mother's hand, the name spoken over a newborn head with dust in the folds. The pool cooled to ordinary water and disappeared into the mat. "3 down," Kene said, voice raw, but Mama Ifeoma shook her head, listening beyond the plaster. "The thief bleeds," she quietly said. "The author hears." Rain fell from a clean blue sky for an hour, then stopped as if someone had remembered to close a tap. When evening unclenched, 4 damp words glowed on Tari's wall without dripping. "I heard you sing." Not threat, attention. Mama Ifeoma's face softened and hardened at once. Not her, the one before her, the river that remembers correctly. The house breathed, the hedges at the gate rustled like old women agreeing, and Leela felt the next road gather itself. The invitation had moved from a thief's mouth to an origin's ear, and whatever came next would not sell them bracelets. It would ask them to return the names they had.
They followed the invitation the way people follow a smell they remember from another life. Rain without clouds, a coolness that threaded the ribs. And by dusk, Leela, Tari, Kene, and Mama Ifeoma were pushing through brush toward Odigo's grove, where elders refused to point and maps refused to be useful. The ground there felt like a drumhead, the air like a held breath, and the trees leaned in as if gossip had turned into liturgy. They set 7 stones the way they had learned, salted the circle until the earth muttered its acceptance, laid the cracked cassette on the soil to sow a spine into the hour, and placed Tari and Ndola back to back within the boundary, their banded heads tilted like tuning forks. "Do not ask for a miracle," Mama Ifeoma warned. "Ask for memory to sort itself." The grove answered first, with a low, old hum rising through their ankles, then with a shape that gathered itself from damp and dusk, a face made of water that forgot to be human whenever it blinked, eyes like deep holes where lost names cooled. It did not speak with sound, it touched each skull at once. "You did not summon me, you stopped drowning long enough to hear." Leela's mouth went dry, but her hands steadied. "You are the first one," she said, voice respectful without kneeling. "Not the thief who wears white." The water face rippled, almost amused. "The thief sings the melody without the mourning," it impressed against their bones. "She collects your pain and lets it call itself faith." Leela lifted the drawings Tari had made, the serpent-crowned woman, the 7 mirrors, the spiral with its notches, and the river's gaze cooled. "These are not mirrors," it wrote across their minds. "They are mouths that hold futures hostage. Return what was borrowed, keep what was born." Mama Ifeoma nodded like a soldier receiving orders she already knew. Leela stepped into the circle until the salt stung her ankles and began to name. She held up the first drawing, the woman waist-deep in water, cradling a mirror, and said, "I name this control stolen. I return it." The air pinched and released, and the paper softened as if it had been washed. She lifted the spiral and said, "I name this counting I did not consent to. I return it." A small wind blinked and moved on. She lifted the sketch of her own face half submerged and said, "I name this silence forced. I return it."
The grove exhaled through 100 hidden mouths, and for one heartbeat, Leela felt her mother's hands in her hair, the way they had been on the day of her naming, the tape's thin voice brightening like new metal in the mind. When she reached the last page, a tangle of Tari's early scribbles from the days before words and after seizure, her voice did not splinter. "I name this child," she said simply, and her mouth remembered how to be a door that opens only toward her. Kept. The water-face warmed, a temperature without heat. Something unlatched across the grove. Bark flexed, roots whispered. Indola, who had been breathing in unsteady threads, sat up straighter as if a tight dress had been cut down the back. Tari's small hand found Leela's and did not tremble. Far away and near, 100 sanctuaries hiccuped. Candled altars stuttered. 7 white-robed women swallowed songs they could no longer pronounce. A fine crack ran down the spine of the night, like a laugh at a funeral that no one could scold because it was right. The thief arrived late, of course. Late but certain. Mother Mirabelle's shape stepping out of the trees, as if the grove had grown her. Tidy, soft-voiced, carrying her staff like punctuation meant to end a sentence. "You've made a mess," she said, and in that gentleness lived a threat as sharp as the first broken bottle. "Return him to the water, and I will give you peace you can spend." The water-face did not turn. It deepened. "You bargain with what you cannot read," it impressed, as if bored. "Your mouths forgot who taught them to open." Mirabelle set the staff to earth. The ground tried to pucker. The salt line hissed. Tari's band flared hot and then cooled, and his voice, little, sure, picked up the seed song's missing curve the way a child picks up a fallen coin. Indola tied it off with a note that felt like a key finally turned. Mirabelle's serenity cracked. Her smile slid wrong. Her staff split like a lie noticing itself. She reached for a mouth that wasn't there, and the grove refused to loan her one. The sky thinned to an honest dark. Somewhere in Sango, a well stopped answering when called. Somewhere in Abriba, a mirror clouded from the inside and rained into its own frame. The water-face lowered itself until it was a shine on the soil. "You remembered correctly," it told Leela. "Gratitude is not consent. Thanks is not a signature. Keep your name in your mouth like a blade you don't show." Then it unmade itself, leaving only damp that smelled clean. They slept on the ground that night without dreaming. At dawn the world had the audacity to behave. Birds practicing vowels, smoke arguing with new sun, the hedges at Ifeoma's gate breathing their medicinal anger like a hymn with manners. News did not carry what happened, but consequences did. Unregistered ministries shuttered without a sermon. Women in white went hoarse, and in more than a dozen towns the hour at 2:13 forgot to open its mouth. Back in Nsango, Tari drew playgrounds, mangoes, and the sky with no mirrors. Sometimes he paused, listening inward, then grinned like he won an argument no one else heard. Leela framed the drawings without explaining them to academics who came sniffing for symbols. She wore her coral beads until they left permanent commas on her skin. Kane launched a small podcast in a room that used to store grief, and people came to lend their voices until silence lost its favorite excuses. On the anniversary, Rain stepped down from a clear noon and stood a while, humming a note that never asked to be finished. Leela tilted her face into it, and Tari appeared in the doorway with an umbrella and a smile big enough to be a verdict. "Let's go inside, Mama." The clock in the flat ticked like a lawful thing. The door did not learn any new names, and if the wind sometimes tuned itself to 4 notes, it ended on 3 and waited, as if remembering that the rest belonged to people who had decided to keep what was born and return what was borrowed.